G'day folks, we are coming to you today from the top of Mount Cootha, the home of the Yuggera people. And so we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging.
And we are here this morning to see the rising sun, a sign of resurrection. For it was on the morning of the third day, as the sun was rising, bringing light and warmth to the world, scattering the darkness and the shadow and the fear, that the disciples came to the tomb, and they saw that it was empty. An empty tomb filled with questions, filled with wonder, filled with hope.
We began our video series by reading the story of Little Pig, and we talked about the way that the stories we tell begin to shape our world. We introduced the concept of followship as a means and a way of understanding that discipleship is a lived response to the call of Christ, and that we are called to follow.
And then we looked at Bonhoeffer's hermeneutic in response to the question that we find in Mark chapter 8, verse 29. Who do you say that I am? Bonhoeffer believed that Christ was already present in the world as the incarnated one, the crucified one, and the resurrected one. Christ, the incarnated one, is the one who brings good news to the poor, opens the eyes of the blind, sets the captives free, and proclaims the year of Jubilee. And we said that wherever we see these things happen, inside the church and outside the church, that Christ is present.
We then talked about Christ the crucified one. We said that the good news of God's love was always welcome, and that sometimes there was a hefty price to pay. When Jesus said he came to bring good news to the poor, they tried to throw him off a cliff.
We then took a closer look at the story of the healing at Bethsaida, and we entered into the story. We discovered that in order to see the crucified one in our midst, sometimes we need to step outside of our comfort zone and have our eyes open to see things more clearly, and that this may require a second or even a third touch from Jesus.
We discovered that sometimes we are the crucified and sometimes we are the crucifier. But of course, Christians believe that crucifixion is not where the story ends. We are the people of the empty tomb, the people of the third day, the people who belong to the coming kingdom. Today we are going to focus on a hermeneutic of the Resurrected One. The Resurrected One is the one who defeats death, who transforms our fear into hope, who calls us to arise from our slumber and venture forth from the tomb. The Resurrected One insists that despite our sin, despite our brokenness, despite our doubt and our failure and our fears, despite the way we treat others, and despite the way we treat ourselves, despite the way we treat Jesus, the incarnate one and the crucified one, despite the broken promises and the betrayal and the abandonment and the nails and the cross and the tomb, despite all the evidence before us, in the end, love wins.
And so to help us understand this a bit better, let us once more immerse ourselves in a well-known gospel narrative. As we learned last week, the gospel stories we tell begin to tell us if we locate ourselves within the story, if we imagine we are one of the characters. And so let us turn to Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be able to be well and to live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had left him and gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the little girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
When we read this story well, we can't help but imagine that we are one of the characters. Perhaps we are like Jairus, so desperate for Jesus to help a person we love. Jairus was the leader of the synagogue, the most important person in town, and here he is publicly humiliating himself, kneeling before the son of a carpenter. Is this something you would do? Would you be willing to put aside your reputation, your desire for others to look up to you, your desire to be respected, your desire to be in control?
Or perhaps we are like the disciples, gathering around Jesus, trying to protect him, trying to make sure there is order amidst the chaos, trying to make sure that everyone sticks to the plan. There is an opportunity here. If Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, it would be a great public relations boost. Maybe others would join the team. Having a powerful, important person like Jairus on board could really advance our mission. If only Jesus could stay focused and not be distracted by these pesky people who demand his attention. You know the ones, the unclean, the unwanted, the sinners.
Perhaps we are like the menstruating woman. In the time of Jesus, menstruating women were considered unclean. They were not allowed to come into the contact with other people. They were forced to isolate. This poor woman had been bleeding for 12 years. Imagine not being able to feel the touch of another person for 12 years. Imagine being ostracized and outcast by a community for 12 long years. For all intents and purposes, you're a non-person. Perhaps you've felt this way in your own life. Perhaps you can relate.
Maybe some of us here have an affinity with those who are mourning. In ancient times, it was considered appropriate social etiquette for displays of public grief when someone died. Public mourners were the ones who legitimized the deeply personal and private grief of those who had lost a loved one. In many ways, public mourners played an advocacy role. They said to onlookers, "Something terrible has happened here." Perhaps this is something you can relate to. Perhaps this is a role that you have played in your life, helping others mourn by mourning with them, publicly protesting injustice, advocating for those who have no voice. And yet, often the zeal with which we approach our task can cloud our vision to see what Christ is doing. Sometimes we can be too busy mourning the injustices of this world that we have lost our ability to hope.
And then there is Jairus' daughter. Before we get to her though, some of you may be thinking, this is all well and good. finding ourselves in the narrative, etc., etc. But what has any of this got to do with resurrection? Well, we're pretty glad you asked. This story is a resurrection story. It is the story of someone, perhaps like you, who is in need of a good old-fashioned wake-up call. There are a few fascinating things about this story. The two people at the centre of this narrative, the two people in need of healing, are never named. They are both simply called daughter. One is the daughter of Jairus, the other is the daughter of Israel. Because they're not named as individuals, it's easy for us to think of them as all of us. The woman who is bleeding is every person who has ever felt isolated and alone because of a system that doesn't recognise them. Everyone who has been cast aside and dehumanised by religious tradition and cultural norms. The people who don't fit in. The people who are ignored. The people many of us think we are better without. To all of the courageous ones who reached out and searched for Jesus, longing to touch even the hem of his robe, even though those around us are trying to hurry him on to more important people and more important places, this story is for you. Thank you for reminding us of what the gospel is all about. Jesus may be on his way to Jairus' place, the most important person in town, but he embraces this interruption and gives his attention to the person in need. It turns out that often God's grace is best found in interruptions to our daily living, while we are on the way to somewhere else.
And Jairus' daughter may not be named, but the story does tell us her age. Again, this is quite fascinating when you think about it. We don't know the age of Jesus, or John the Baptist, or any of the disciples, but we do know the age of Jairus' daughter. This is a literary device that draws our attention to the fact that for her entire life, growing up in the centre of power and privilege, she has lived in stark contrast to the bleeding woman. Jairus' daughter probably never wanted for anything. The bleeding woman ceased to be treated as a human being. As we said before, this story is a resurrection story. I wonder, can we dare to see ourselves as Jairus' daughter? And we have succumbed to the malaise of indifference. Indifference to the suffering that goes on all around us. Indifference is a disease. Let's face it, sometimes it appears to be quite contagious, and it may in fact be terminal. For to ignore those in need is to forgo the opportunity for healing and hope that we all long for. But as it turns out, we aren't dead yet. Just as Jairus' daughter, we are only sleeping. And Jesus has come to wake us up. Friends, it is time for us to rise, to get up. It is resurrection time.
There are elements of this story that tend to lean more towards an idea of resuscitation rather than resurrection. Resuscitation is the process of coming back to life, having life restored. Resurrection is about something entirely different, being born again into a new world, a new creation. In all of the gospel narratives, the resurrected Jesus was not even recognised by the disciples at first. There was something about him that was different. Resurrection is not a restoration to how things were, but instead signals that something new has begun. In some of his early writings, German theologian Jürgen Moltmann sought to discourage the church in the language it was using with respect to overcoming systemic injustice. The work of the church is not about rebelling against injustice or even hoping for some sort of revolution. For the word rebellion describes a war against injustice, but says nothing about what is to take place. It is simply a war against, and the word revolution describes a turning back of injustice. But all too often, revolutions lead to more injustice, and the new systems put in place simply become new versions of the old. The danger is that revolution becomes a revolving door. Moltmann instead prefers the term provolution. This is a word whereby the human dream is turned forward. Provolution occurs when we open ourselves to a new future that is not of our own making, when we turn against the injustice of old and turn towards new possibilities, new opportunities, expecting that things will not be the same. With this word provolution in the background, I wonder if it might challenge the way we think about resurrection. I wonder if the word prosurrection might open up new conversations for us. You see, all too often the word resurrection is thought of more like resuscitation, something that has died coming back to life. But that simply imagines more of the same. Resurrection or prosurrection imagines something entirely new. There are many other resurrection stories that we could look at right now, but I want to go back once more to Mark's Gospel, the first narrative we have of the resurrection of Jesus. Let's read from Mark chapter 16. Mark 16, 1-8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
The resurrection is an invitation to all who are trembling and afraid, to all who have experienced trauma and loss, to all who are stepping into an unknown future, where the things of the past will no longer define what lies ahead. Make no mistake, the Resurrected One has gone before us and beyond us and is calling us out of the tomb.
We invite you now to open your Bibles and begin your study. May the Resurrected One be present to you, and may your hearts and minds be enlivened by the power of the Holy Spirit and the love and the grace of God. Amen.